I'm at 69 years old, sitting at a plastic table outside a cafe in Dumaguete, and I've got a notebook in front of me that's seen better days. The cover's curling from humidity. There's a coffee stain shaped like Florida on page 11, and I've got a flight number written on the inside back cover that I booked 3 months ago, back when I thought I understood exactly what I was doing here. If you'd asked me on day 6 what this trip was about, I could have given you the answer in about 4 seconds. $8,000, 90 days. Find out if a retired maintenance man from Arizona could make his money stretch further somewhere else, then go home and make a real decision with real numbers instead of guesses. That was the whole plan. Clean, practical. The kind of plan I've made my whole life. But something happened on day 7 that I didn't see coming, and it had nothing to do with money. And by the time I noticed what it had done to me, I was already sitting here on day 90 trying to figure out how a broken refrigerator compressor turned into the biggest decision of the back half of my life. Let me back up. 3 months, roughly. I spent 31 years as a maintenance supervisor for a company that managed commercial properties around Phoenix. Strip malls, office parks, a couple of apartment complexes we picked up in the later years. If a walk-in cooler died at a restaurant at 11 on a Friday night, my phone rang. If a rooftop unit started throwing error codes during a heat wave, my phone rang. If a plumber no-showed and a tenant was flooding, guess whose phone rang? For 3 decades, people needed me at odd hours for real problems, and I fixed most of them. And the ones I couldn't fix myself, I knew exactly who to call. Then I retired at 66. Good pension, decent 401k, house paid off. On paper, I did everything right. The first few months were fine. I told myself I'd earned the quiet. I fixed things around the house that didn't need fixing. I reorganized my garage twice. I watched more television than I want to admit to my daughter. Somewhere around month 8, I noticed my phone had stopped ringing before 7 in the morning. Ever. My tools sat in the same order I'd left them in. Days started looking like other days. Nobody needed me to look at anything. That's not depression. And I want to be careful not to make it sound bigger than it was. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet you don't notice until it's been going on for a while, and you realize you built your whole identity around being the guy people called. On top of that, Arizona wasn't cheap. My property taxes crept up every year. Insurance did too. I wasn't going broke. My pension and Social Security covered my bills with some leftover. But the margin was thinner than it used to be. And every year I did the math on how a decade of inflation would treat a decade of retirement. The number got less comfortable. So I started reading about retiring abroad. Half the stuff online is nonsense. Guys in polo shirts standing on a beach telling you that you can live like a king on $900 a month. I don't trust anybody who tells me something's easy when they're also trying to sell me a course about it. But underneath the nonsense, there was something real. Cost of living in a lot of places is genuinely lower, and some of it made sense to a guy who'd spent his career pricing out repairs and knowing the difference between what something costs and what somebody's charging for it. I didn't decide to move anywhere. I decided to test something. $8,000. 90 days. Not my life savings. I want to be clear about that, because a lot of guys my age hear a story like this and think somebody's telling them to fly across the ocean with their whole retirement in a duffel bag. That's not what I did. The $8,000 was a test fund. Rent, food, transportation, phone, a cushion for anything that went wrong, and a return ticket sitting there the whole time like a parachute I didn't expect to need, but wasn't dumb enough to leave behind. My daughter Emily wasn't thrilled. She's 41, lives in Colorado, has her own kids, and her own job managing a dental practice, and she called me the week I booked the flight. "Dad, why the Philippines? Why not just look at somewhere in the States?" "Because I can afford to test it," I told her. 90 days. If it doesn't work, I fly home and I've lost a chunk of money I can afford to lose. If it does work, I've learned something. And if you like it and you don't come home, then we'll have a different conversation in 90 days. Right now, we're not having that conversation. She wasn't happy, but she's never been the type to fight me on something once she sees I've actually thought it through. She just made me promise to call every week. I did. I picked Dumaguete over Manila or Cebu because everything I read said it was smaller, calmer, the kind of place where you could actually get to know your street instead of disappearing into 8 million people. I liked that idea. I've never been a city guy. The arrival wasn't romantic. I want to say that clearly because I've read some of these retirement stories online, where the guy steps off the plane and the tropical air hits him and he feels reborn. What hit me was heat like a wet towel over my face. A taxi driver who wanted 3 times the fair price until I pulled out a number I'd researched in advance, and a motorcycle nearly clipping my suitcase before I'd been in the country 20 minutes. I was jet-lagged, sweating through my shirt, and already annoyed at myself for not packing lighter clothes. My rental was a one-bedroom about 15 minutes from the city center, $430 a month, furnished, nothing fancy, a bed, a table, a window unit AC that worked when it felt like it. I unpacked, and the first thing I did, before I even ate, was open my notebook and write the number 8,000 at the top of a page, draw a line under it, and start subtracting. That's who I am. I've never trusted a plan I haven't put numbers to. I divided it out. 8,000 over 90 days is roughly $89 a day if I spent every dollar and had nothing left for the flight home, which obviously wasn't the plan. I was working off a tighter number, closer to 60 a day, keeping a real cushion. Every purchase went in the notebook. Coffee, $2. Rice and fish from a stall down the street, $3.50. Laundry, $1.20. Phone data plan, $12 for the month. I was treating my retirement like a maintenance budget on a building, which I suppose is exactly what 31 years of that job trains you to do to everything, including your own life. Days 3 and 4, I found the cafe. It was a narrow little place, a 5-minute walk from my rental, hand-painted sign, 6 tables, run by a guy named Marco and his wife Liza. I went in because it was cheap and close, not because of anything deeper than that. Eggs, rice, coffee, less than $3, and it beat cooking for myself in a kitchen I didn't fully trust yet. Marco noticed the notebook the second morning I was in there. "You writing a book?" he asked, setting down my plate. "Just keeping track," I said. "Track of what?" "Everything. What I spend. Trying to figure out if I can actually live here or if I'm fooling myself." He laughed, not unkindly. "You calculate the price of the egg? I calculate the price of everything." "American," he said, shaking his head, and went back to the counter, but he was smiling when he said it. Over the next few mornings we developed a rhythm. I'd come in, he'd bring my plate without me ordering because by day 5 he already knew what I got, and we'd talk for a minute or two. Nothing deep. He told me he'd had the cafe for 9 years, that Liza did the books because he was, in his words, bad with numbers, good with customers. I learned he had 2 kids in school. I didn't learn much more than that, and I didn't ask much more than that. He was my breakfast place, not my new best friend. I want to be honest about the pace of it, because it wasn't instant. Outside the cafe, Dumaguete was a mixed bag those first days. The boulevard along the water was nice to walk in the evening. The market was overwhelming and a little too loud for a man used to Home Depot on a Tuesday morning. I got overcharged twice for things I later learned should have cost half as much. I missed knowing where anything was. By the end of day 6, I sat on my bed and wrote in the notebook, under the day's expenses, "Cheap enough. Don't know if cheap is enough." That was the honest state of things going into day 7. I still thought this whole trip was about a spreadsheet. Day 7 changed the question. I walked into the cafe that morning and something was off before I even sat down. There was a handwritten sign taped to the glass case up front. I couldn't read all of it, something about the cold drinks. And Liza was on the phone looking tense, and Marco was crouched behind the counter with his hand pressed against the side of a big chest freezer, the kind that holds ice cream tubs and cold sodas. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Freezer's dying," he said. "Since last night. Everything inside is going soft." "You call someone?" "Guy came this morning. Wants $400 to replace the compressor. Or I buy a whole new unit. That's worse." Either way, it's money I don't have sitting around this week. $400 doesn't sound like much sitting in Arizona, but I understood immediately what that number meant for a six-table cafe. That's not pocket change. That's a real hit. I stood there for a second, and I want to be honest, my first instinct was the instinct of a retired man who doesn't want to intrude. It's not my business. I'm a customer. I sat down at my table like I was going to order breakfast like any other day, but I could hear the compressor cycling from where I sat, and something about the sound bothered me. Not because I'm sentimental about refrigeration units, because I've heard that exact sound 1,000 times over 31 years, the stutter and click of a compressor trying to start and failing, and every professional instinct I had told me the diagnosis that guy gave Marco was probably wrong, or at least incomplete. Mind if I take a look? I said. Marco looked at me like I'd offered to perform surgery. You know refrigeration? I did maintenance for commercial buildings for 31 years. Restaurants, offices, whatever broke. I've replaced more compressors than I can count, and I've also seen a lot of guys quote a full replacement when the real problem was something a lot cheaper. He hesitated, glanced at Liza, who shrugged like she didn't have a better option, and said, "Okay, look, I got down on the floor in front of that freezer in my second-best shirt and asked him for a flashlight and a screwdriver, which took him a minute to find. I checked the condenser coils first, caked in dust and grease from 9 years of a busy kitchen, which alone can make a unit struggle and overheat and shut itself down as a protection measure. I checked the fan behind the coils. It was barely turning, practically seized from the same buildup. I want to be careful here, because I'm not going to walk anybody through exact repair steps. That's not the point of this story, and it's not something you should attempt on a running electrical appliance without knowing what you're doing. But I will say that between the coils and the fan, there was a very plausible, very ordinary explanation for a unit that looked like it needed a $400 compressor, and might not have needed one at all. I told Marco what I saw. I told him it was worth cleaning the coils properly and freeing up that fan before anybody spent money on a new compressor, and that if it still didn't hold temperature after that, then fine. The compressor quote was probably right and he could go ahead. But not before ruling out the cheap explanation first. It took about 40 minutes with Marco holding the flashlight and asking me questions, and Liza checking on us between customers. When we plugged it back in, the compressor kicked on clean, no stutter, and started pulling the temperature down steadily instead of struggling. Marco stood there watching the little display for a solid minute like he didn't trust it. That's it? That's the whole problem? Might not be forever, but it's working, and you didn't spend $400 finding out. He looked at me different after that. Not dramatically. Nobody threw a parade, but something shifted in how he saw me. What did you say you did before? Maintenance supervisor. Commercial buildings. So this is like your job. Was my job. Man, he said, laughing, shaking his head. You retired to fix my freezer. He tried to pay me, pulled bills out of the register before I could stop him. I told him no, and I meant it. I hadn't done it for money, and taking money would have turned something I didn't fully understand yet into a transaction, and it didn't feel like it wanted to be a transaction. He argued for a minute, the way people do when they feel like they owe you something and don't like sitting with that feeling unresolved. Finally, he said, "Fine, breakfast, free. Every day you're here. I'm not asking again." I sat down at my usual table after that, and Liza brought my plate. And I want to tell you, I had some big emotional realization right there, with rice getting cold in front of me. But that's not how it happened. What actually happened is I just felt good. Simply, plainly good. In a way I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. Somebody had a real problem. I knew something. It mattered. Nobody paid me for it, and it didn't need to be paid for. I didn't write anything about it in the notebook that morning besides the cost of breakfast, which was 0. I didn't understand yet what day 7 had actually done. I just knew I walked back to my rental feeling like I'd done something, instead of feeling like I was waiting out a countdown. The days after that didn't turn into some parade of Frank the Handyman saves Dumaguete. And I want to be clear about that because it would be a lie to tell it that way. Marco didn't need me every day. He had a business to run and a family and his own life, same as before. But something had opened up between us that hadn't been there on day 6. A few days later, he asked my opinion when a guy quoted him a price to fix a wiring issue on the cafe's outdoor lighting, and I told him what sounded reasonable and what sounded padded. I wasn't doing the work. I was just somebody who'd priced out 3 decades of exactly that kind of job and could tell him whether he was being taken advantage of. Around the same time, I got to talking with a British retiree named Colin who ate at a restaurant 2 doors down, and somehow it came up that I used to do maintenance work, and he asked me to take a look at a ceiling fan in his apartment that wobbled like it might come down on somebody's head. 10 minutes, a tightened mounting bracket, done. He bought me a beer for it, which I accepted, because a beer isn't the same as $400, and I wasn't going to be precious about every gesture of thanks for the rest of my 90 days. I noticed something around day 12 that stopped me for a second. I'd gone half a day without opening the notebook to check my running total. Half a day. For a man who'd been tracking every peso since he landed, that was practically a national holiday. I didn't make a big thing of it. I just noticed it, wrote it down that night. Didn't check the numbers till after lunch. Don't know what that means yet. And kept going. I called Emily that week like I promised. She asked the usual first question, how much I'd spent, and normally I'd have the figure ready before she finished asking. This time I told her about the freezer before I told her about the money. I told her about crouching on the floor of a cafe with a flashlight in my teeth like I was 40 years old again instead of 69. She laughed. You've been retired for 3 years and you're over there fixing somebody's refrigerator for free. Somebody had to. Guy quoted him $400 for nothing. There was a pause on the line, and then she said, "You sound different, Dad." Different how? I don't know. Busy. Like you've got somewhere to be in the morning. I didn't have a good answer for that. I told her I'd call next week, and I hung up, and I sat with what she'd said longer than I expected to. By the end of the first month, I sat down and did the real math, the kind I trust more than feelings. Rent, $430. Food, including the free breakfasts I still tried to occasionally pay for even though Marco refused, around $380. Transportation, mostly tricycles and the occasional longer trip, about $90. Phone and utilities, roughly $110. Miscellaneous, laundry, a haircut, a couple of beers with Colin, replacing a pair of sandals that fell apart in the heat, around $260. All told, just under $1,250 for the month, which put me comfortably inside my 60-a-day target with room to spare. The number told me what I'd come to find out. The money worked. It genuinely worked. Better than I'd let myself hope for back in Arizona reading skeptical articles at my kitchen table. But sitting there with that page of totals in front of me, I realized the number wasn't the most interesting thing that had happened to me that month. That surprised me more than the number itself did. I'd built a 90-day test around a financial question, and the financial question had gotten quietly boring compared to everything else going on around it. It wasn't all smooth, and I don't want to make it sound like it was. There was a stretch in the second month, about 5 days straight, where it rained hard enough that the street outside my rental turned into a shallow river and I couldn't get anywhere without soaking my shoes. My internet went out for 2 full days with no clear explanation and no clear timeline for a fix, which for a man used to calling a number and getting a truck out same day, was its own kind of maddening. I missed things I hadn't expected to miss. A specific brand of coffee, driving my own truck instead of hailing a tricycle every time I needed to go somewhere, the particular quiet of my own living room back home. One night, after the internet had been out for 2 days, and I'd gotten overcharged for a bag of hardware I needed, I sat on my bed and pulled up my return flight information and stared at it a long while. I reminded myself this was always temporary. 90 days. That had been the deal I made with myself and with Emily. Nobody had asked me to fall in love with this place. I was allowed to just finish the test and go home with an answer. I might have talked myself into exactly that if I hadn't run into Daniel Brooks around that same stretch. Daniel was 71, from Oregon originally, and had been living in Dumaguete for about 4 years. I met him at the cafe, where else, sitting at the table next to mine, and we got to talking because he overheard Marco and me discussing whether it was worth replacing a section of gutter on the building before the next heavy rain. "You're the freezer guy," Daniel said, grinning. "Marco talks about you. Word travels. It's a small city." He introduced himself, and we ended up talking for the better part of an hour. He wasn't selling me anything, which I appreciated immediately, because by that point I'd read enough online forums full of guys practically frothing at the mouth about how perfect their expat life was, and it always made me suspicious. Daniel told me flat out that the healthcare situation required real planning, that the bureaucracy for visas could eat up a whole afternoon for something that should take 10 minutes, that he still missed his sister's Thanksgiving dinner every single year, and there was no substitute for it here. He wasn't trying to talk me into anything. "So, what are you doing here exactly?" he asked. 90 days, Marco said. "Testing whether I can afford to live here. $8,000, see how far it stretches. Then I go home and decide with real numbers instead of guessing." Daniel nodded slowly, like he'd heard some version of that plan plenty of times before. "Okay. But what are you retiring to?" "What do you mean?" "I mean everybody your age and mine. We spend a couple years figuring out what we're retiring from. The job, the commute, the boss. Took me about a year to even ask myself what I was retiring to. Some guys never ask it. They just move somewhere cheap and wonder 6 months in why they're miserable in a nicer house." I didn't have an answer for him right there, and I didn't like that I didn't have one. I've spent my whole life being a man with an answer. I changed the subject. We finished our coffee, and he gave me his number in case I wanted to grab a beer sometime. No pressure attached to it either way. That question sat in me for days. "What are you retiring to?" In Arizona, my whole retirement plan had been defensive. Protect the pension, watch the spending, don't run out before I run out of time. Coming here, the plan had just been an extension of that same defense, a way of stretching the same dollars further. It had never once occurred to me to ask what I wanted my days to actually be made of, only how much they were allowed to cost. I started paying attention to my own days differently after that. Not dramatically. I didn't turn into some new man overnight. But I started deliberately building small routines instead of just drifting through the 90 days waiting for the total to land where I expected. I helped Marco price out that gutter repair properly, which saved him from a padded quote for the second time. I showed a woman who ran a small hardware stall how I organized my tools, mostly because she asked, and it gave us something to talk about. I met Daniel for coffee most Thursdays and let him talk me out of a couple of bad ideas, including a phone plan that would have cost me twice what I needed. I learned the names of the guys who ran the tricycles on my street. None of it was heroic. All of it filled hours that used to just be hours. By day 60, I checked the numbers again out of habit more than worry. I'd spent well under what I budgeted, comfortably on pace to come in under the 8,000 with a real cushion left for the flight home and beyond. I told Emily on our call that week, and she was glad. And then she asked, the way she always did, "So you're still on for coming home on day 90? Every other week I'd said yes without thinking about it. This time I actually paused. "I don't know," I told her. Neither of us said anything for a second. "You don't know," she repeated, not upset, just surprised, testing the words. "I don't know yet," I said. "I've got 30 days left. I'm not deciding anything today." She didn't push, which I was grateful for. She just said, "Okay, Dad, let me know." And we talked about her kids for a while and hung up on good terms. But I sat there afterward feeling like I'd said something out loud that I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. I made myself sit down with the harder side of it, because I've never trusted a decision that only looked at what I wanted to hear. I missed my daughter, plainly and honestly, more than I'd expected to. I missed driving my own truck, having my own space without ever thinking about tricycle fare or timing errands around rain. I missed the predictability of American systems, whatever their flaws, knowing that if my internet went out, there was a number to call and a rough sense of when it'd be fixed. Staying longer, or moving here properly, meant dealing with visa requirements I'd only half researched, figuring out healthcare in a system I didn't fully understand yet, being a plane ride and a full day of travel away from Emily and my grandkids instead of a few hours. It meant keeping a real emergency fund on top of everything else, not just an $8,000 test budget. I want to say clearly, because it matters, that $8,000 was never meant to be enough to retire on forever. It was a test fund. My pension and Social Security were the real foundation underneath any decision I made, and anybody hearing this story and thinking $8,000 is a retirement plan is misunderstanding the whole point of what I did. So it wasn't an easy decision, and I don't want to pretend it was. Which brings me back to where I started, sitting at that cafe table on day 90 with my notebook open in front of me. I flipped back to the first pages. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3, nothing but numbers. Rent, coffee, rice, tricycle fare, subtraction after subtraction, a man tracking his own survival like a building he was managing. Somewhere around Day 8, the entries start changing, not all at once, just a line here and there mixed in with the money. Fixed cafe freezer, Marco surprised. A few days later, coffee with Daniel, talked visas, healthcare, need to actually research this. Later still, helped hardware stall lady organize her tools. Called Emily, told her about the freezer before the money for once. The notebook hadn't stopped being about money. It had just stopped being only about money. I understood, sitting there, that my 90 days had actually answered two separate questions, and I'd only set out to ask one of them. The first question was whether I could afford to live here, and the honest answer was yes. With real planning, with my actual retirement income behind me and not just a test fund, it was financially workable. The second question I hadn't known I was asking until Day 7 answered it for me before I even understood what it meant. Did I have something left to build, something left to give, somewhere for that 31 years of knowledge to still matter to somebody? I'd spent years believing retirement had taken away my usefulness along with my paycheck, and it took a stranger's broken freezer to show me that wasn't true. Retirement had ended my career. It hadn't ended what I knew, or what I still had to offer somebody who needed it. I didn't burn my return ticket in some dramatic gesture. That's not who I am, and it wouldn't have been honest anyway, because a decision that big deserved more care than a symbolic act at an airport. What I decided, sitting there on Day 90, was that I'd fly home as planned, see Emily properly, sit down with a financial advisor about what a longer or permanent stay abroad would actually require, sort out the healthcare questions Daniel had warned me about, handle the paperwork right instead of guessing at it. And then, if all of that lined up the way I expected it to, I'd come back. Not for another 90-day test, but for something closer to a real chapter, built the right way instead of rushed into on a feeling. I closed the notebook and walked over to the cafe. Marco was crouched by the counter again, and for half a second my stomach did something ridiculous. Some little flicker of hope that history was repeating itself on cue like a movie. It wasn't the freezer this time. Just a wobbly table leg he was trying to wedge with a folded napkin. He looked up at me, half smiling already. "Don't even ask," I said, before he could. He laughed. "I wasn't gonna ask. You were gonna ask. Maybe a little." I sat down anyway, got up after my coffee, and fixed the table leg properly instead of leaving it propped on a napkin, because that's who I am. And because for the first time in a long while, being that guy again felt like exactly where I was supposed to be.